Hello, everyone. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the Robert F. Kennedy Forum here. We're thrilled to have you. Let me start with a simple request that if you have a cell phone, this might be an opportune time to, at a minimum, turn it to vibrate and ideally to turn it off. This is a very important event for us and would hate to be interrupted. It's my great pleasure to welcome a familiar face here to the Kennedy School and to the Forum, Nan Cohen. She is tonight she's going to deliver the 2005 Edwin L. Godkin Lecture. And the Godkin Lecture is perhaps the most prestigious of Harvard's endowed lectures and was established in recognition of Edwin Godkin's lifetime of contributions to political journalism and open debate in the United States. He was born and educated in Ireland and emigrated to America in 1856. Within a decade, he became the first editor of The Nation, a progressive weekly publication to which Godkin gave breadth of view, a moral tone, and a scholarly quality that brought it immediate recognition. He later became editor-in-chief of the New York Evening Post, and until his retirement in 1900, he exercised enormous influence on public opinion and political discourse in the United States. In 1903, his friends established this lecture in his honor in order to bring speakers to Harvard to discuss issues related to free government and civic responsibility. And tonight's speaker couldn't be more appropriate for that task, and she is indeed one of the most admired and influential figures in academia and beyond, not only for her work as a political philosopher, but also for her amazing ability to lead and transform institutions of higher learning. She was born in Arkansas and raised in Arkansas, Texas, South Carolina. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Wellesley in 1961. She then studied at Oxford. She was a Marshall Scholar, earning a BA, MA with first-class honors in philosophy, politics, and economics. And if you know the system, that's very impressive. She later received her PhD in political science from Yale. She could be forgiven for such things, where she was a Sterling Fellow. After serving as a professor of political science at Swarthmore, at the University of Pennsylvania, and Stanford, where she rose to become the faculty chair of the Senate and won the Gores Award for excellence in teaching, she was appointed, never having served any office like this at all, president of her alma mater, Wellesley, a position she held for 12 years from 1981 to 1993. She was then selected to be the president of Duke University, where she served until 2004. And under her very thoughtful and innovative leadership, Duke launched an array of new programs in areas ranging from ethics to the genome sciences and policy to interdisciplinary studies in the humanities. The university also broadened its commitment to international affairs, pursued improvements in undergraduate education, restructured and expanded its academic medical center, and they carried out a $2 billion fundraising campaign. She not only was president, she also taught as a professor of political science, something that I have not figured out how one does, even at a much smaller environment. And as any president of Duke must, she became an avid basketball fan. I checked on this story before I came in, and this is apparently an absolutely true story. There was once a time before she became president of Duke when she thought the Final Four were Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, and Chiang Kai-shek. She also told me that might go over okay in this audience, would not work at Duke. She's made several profound contributions to the fields of political philosophy, feminism, and education. She's author of Philosophy and the State of France, The Renaissance to the Enlightenment, and co-editor of Feminist Theory, a Critique of Ideology. One of the best things for us has been that throughout this period, Nan has also been close by to Harvard. For example, she spent a year at Widener and Houghton libraries while working on her first book in 1972. She's been a longtime member of the Board of Overseers Visiting Committee at the Kennedy School and was for a long time chair of our visiting committee. She received an honorary Doctor of Laws from Harvard in 1993. Her husband, Robert Cohen, who's here with us, got a PhD in '66 and was the Stanfield Professor of International Peace at Harvard and served as chair of the government department. The Cohanes have 4 children, 2 of them Harvard alumni, 7 grandchildren, and one of their children, Nathaniel, actually studied here at the Kennedy School, received his PhD in political economy and government in 2001. He's now assistant professor of economics at the Yale School of Management. Finally, as many of you know, she's the newest member of or will become the newest member of the Harvard Corporation, beginning her term in July 1st, 2005. In the interim, Nan is spending time at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences in Stanford, and next year she'll serve as the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Distinguished Visiting Professor of Public Affairs at Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. This is a remarkable woman. She has a great deal to say about everything from political philosophy to leadership, but what's remarkable about her is she will talk about both and how they interact and how we ought to think about it. This is a particularly opportune moment for us to welcome Nan Cohane.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that gracious introduction. I'm very honored to be here with all of you. I am glad to be part of what is clearly a very distinguished lineup of Godkin lecturers across the years. And I also want to salute those who join us from some distance, including faculty members and students at Wellesley College who are watching in the very first Pendleton East Forum, courtesy of video streaming technology. Harvard reaches out. There you go. Understanding leadership, my topic tonight, is a high priority for many people, including scholars, policy analysts, and ordinary folks who are just trying to figure out how to live with leaders and their works. But what is it, after all? What, if anything, do the President of the United States, the head of an insurgent group in Iraq, and your friend who takes the lead in planning a weekend expedition have in common? In this lecture, I want to offer a particular perspective on leadership, which is the perspective of a scholar trained in political philosophy who has spent half her life as a college and university president, half her adult life. I shall not until the very end refer specifically to the fact that I am a woman leader, because everything I say tonight, to my mind, applies equally to leaders of both sexes. And in this talk, I want to emphasize the similarities and not the differences. Now, it's unusual for political philosophers to be leaders in large organizations. It's equally rare for someone in authority to have the background and the mindset that political theory provides. Some of you may think of Plato. The world's problems will not be solved, he said famously in The Republic, unless philosophers become kings or kings take up philosophy. I have no illusion about being a philosopher queen, but I think Plato was right to comment on the rarity of the combination. Most essays on leadership, and many of you in this room know a great deal about those, are written from one perspective or another. Either a scholar looks at leadership from the outside, so to speak, or a leader reflects on his, and much more rarely her, personal experience. Leaders write memoirs and anecdotes. Gleaning general lessons from those experiences is usually something done by someone else. In the last few decades, a large body of literature has grown up from scholars offering theories about leadership, and some of the best of those are right here at Harvard, as many of you know. Whereas most traditional political philosophers, from Aristotle to Rawls, discuss ways in which leadership can be structured to be beneficial for subjects like themselves. They write about the organizations in which leaders hold power, the duties of rulers and subjects, justice and injustice, freedom and oppression. They provide valuable perspectives on leadership, but they seldom write about what it feels like to be a leader or what makes leaders tick. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule. Machiavelli's Prince comes first to mind. His topic was specifically what it means to hold power and how to succeed as a leader. Machiavelli himself had held minor power as a diplomat and militia supervisor and had ample opportunities to observe leaders in action. He was clearly fascinated by power. In fact, he may have been motivated to write specifically by his lack of it. Another exception is Max Weber's essay called Politics as a Vocation. Weber's father was an active politician, and he himself was deeply engaged in German politics throughout his life. And my talk tonight is offered in the same spirit as that essay, reflections on leadership that are not anecdotal, but that depend on an unusual degree of intimacy with power. You might think of it as an exercise in bringing theory and practice together. I shall not claim, at least not yet, to offer a comprehensive theory of leadership, but my comments are designed to be useful both to people who are studying leadership or those who are and have ambitions to be leaders. So if we look at leadership from the inside, so to speak, what are the first things that come to mind? One is a focus on what leaders actually do, how they spend their time, how they allocate their energies. Another is the skills or traits that might prove useful to leaders, not just those we might ideally wish they would display. Still another is the impact of leadership on the leader. How does having power affect your personality and your perspective on the world? I'll explore each of these, but first I want to say a word about the particular kind of leadership that I exercised for a good part of my life. Being a college or university president is sometimes compared with other kinds of leadership: mayor, preacher, cheerleader, coach, corporate CEO. But at Duke, in an early address to the faculty, I used a different image, which seems to me a very apt one. I said it the following. To the faculty, we are in a position of a group of adventurers linked by institutional affiliation, all in the same boat, as the saying goes, generally agreed on our destination. We know that there will be unforeseen storms and currents. We may be buffeted about, blown off course, becalmed. They know there will be problems with logistics in the galley and arguments about how to get back on course at the helm. We also know that there is no Loran system cueing us in precisely to our location on this globe at every moment of our trip. There are only compasses and rough maps indicating generally the direction in which our destination lies. But we're better off relying on those guides rather than just setting out and trusting our luck to wind up someplace interesting. I noted that Duke had been compared to a large ship, big and cumbersome and hard to move. I suggested that Duke might better be compared to a flotilla, made up of several schools of different sizes, each with its own resources and some degree of independence. And on the role of president, I said, captaining a flotilla is complex in many ways, not least because it is hard to get everyone on board at the same time. Nonetheless, there are many advantages in a flotilla rather than a streamlined cruise ship or certainly a cumbersome barge. If we are to be a collection of enterprises, I like this metaphor better than each tub on its own bottom. There are advantages of deftness, imagination, variety. Much better, I said, to be a group of boats going somewhere together, however haphazardly, than a stolid set of tubs firmly positioned on their bottoms. A familiar alternative to the captain of a flotilla might be a feudal system, with the deans as barons and the president as a more or less powerful monarch. But in practice, captaining a flotilla feels more apt, given the sense of shared adventure, movement, and restlessness that a campus exemplifies. Each of the other ships in a decentralized university has its own captain, a dean who commands a good deal of autonomy. Yet Duke or Harvard, the name Duke or Harvard, and the concept of the university, its traditions, its alumni loyalties, are more powerful for a variety of purposes than those of the individual schools. And the central administration can do some things more efficiently, rather than each ship having a full range of services and materiel. The image of a captain of a flotilla, however, would not work for being president of Wellesley College, which is a smaller, more cohesive institution, just one ship, although with lots of different people on board. Nor would it work for a corporate CEO, the governor of a state, or any of the three examples of leadership I mentioned at the outset. But I think all of these exemplars and others must have something in common, because we use the same term leadership to describe them. So I'll now step back and offer some generalizations about what leadership is like. What do leaders actually do? They make decisions. They listen to proposals or petitions from others. They assemble resources and deploy incentives, both rewards and sanctions. They give voice to vision and articulate goals. They identify strategies for solving problems and reaching goals, and they attempt to persuade or require or force others to follow a course of action they have determined is desirable. But leaders also enlist other people to work with them, colleagues and subordinates, and they delegate tasks to those other people. This is a crucial component of successful leadership. Machiavelli put it well, and I quote, "The choosing of ministers is a matter of no little importance for a prince, and their worth depends on the sagacity of the prince himself. The first opinion that is formed of a ruler's intelligence is based on the quality of the men he has around him." Now, in many of these activities, leadership is a lot like life. We all make decisions, assemble resources, envision goals, develop strategies, seek partners, and try to get others to do things that we think they ought to do. So what's so special about leadership? 3 things seem to me especially important. First, the scope of the activities in terms of the issues being addressed and the number of human beings who are affected. Secondly, the legitimacy of the process, an organizational context that gives this particular person, the leader, the authority, the scope to make those decisions, assemble those resources, etc. And finally, the stability of the role, so that the consequences carry over from one time period or one activity to another. This means that there is a persistent asymmetry between the distinctive actions of the leader on the one hand and the followers on the other, which is reflected less often in daily life. Now, that persistent asymmetry between the leader and the follower is, to me, at the heart of what we call power. And those of you who are familiar with James McGregor Burns' classic study on leadership may have noticed that the title I chose for this talk, The Power of Leadership, is also the title of the first section of his book. I chose it to emphasize that leaders exercise power, and that exercising power is a distinctive dimension of human experience. Burns goes on to stress the relationship between the leader and the followers. I see his point, but speaking as someone who has been a leader, the relationships seem less distinctive than the power itself. Knowing what followers do and expect is crucially important to leadership. But there are good reasons why we speak of power as something that you have or exercise. And one of the purposes of this talk is to convey something of how this feels, what it requires of you and what it does to you as well. In 1981, my colleagues in political philosophy, somewhat bemused by my decision to move to the president's office, wondered why I would leave the sunlit uplands of scholarship for Plato's cave. Why would I spend my days helping people sort through shadowy reflections of reality rather than directly contemplating the forms of truth? I have feared the job might feel this way, but in fact the image is way off the mark. Leadership requires as much mental acuity as scholarship, but of a different kind, and the issues that you deal with are anything but shadowy. Successful leadership, like scholarship, involves a degree of expertise in carrying out your tasks that helps explain why others follow you. That point has gotten somewhat lost in modern studies of leadership. Yet the expertise is there. Most leaders in modern democracies or universities are, in the spirit of Aristotle's politics, ruling and being ruled in turn. But to be successful at the ruling part, you need to develop expertise that's different from the expertise of the citizen or the faculty member. There's a division of labor here, and that's one of the reasons successful organizations need leaders. Now, ideally, as Aristotle said, people who gain expertise as leaders would continue to lead, and others would go on doing what they do best, whether it's making shoes or writing books. But as Aristotle pointed out, and we all know, there are major problems with that plan. Leaders are subject to ordinary human frailties and particular pitfalls of power, and I'll come back to that. So there are clear advantages to a system in which everyone has opportunities to participate, both in providing effective constraints on the misbehavior of leaders and in being involved in making the laws that govern you. So even participatory democracies, however, require leadership, and that means some degree of power. In his own classic study, John Gardner distinguishes among 4 closely related phenomena: power, status, authority, and leadership. He notes, quote, "Leaders always have some measure of power, but that many people with power are without leadership gifts." And he then goes on to say, "Leadership requires major expenditures of effort and energy, more than most people care to make. When I outlined to a teenager of my acquaintance," he said, "the preceding distinctions and described the hard tasks of leadership, he said, 'I'll leave the leadership to you, Mr. Gardner. Give me some of the power and status.'" So leaders are power holders, often with authority and status, but what we do isn't reducible to either. And although we may call the friend who volunteers to organize the weekend expedition a leader, this doesn't get into the kind of sustained behavior most of us have in mind when we use that term. Now that we've noticed some of the things that leaders do, what kinds of traits or personal skills are useful in doing them? Providing lists of these traits is one of the favorite pursuits of scholars who study leadership. My own list of 5 useful traits captures those I regard as most significant. First of all, good judgment in all contexts, identifying issues and priorities, knowing where you put your time and energy, making decisions, choosing lieutenants. It's hard to overstate the importance of good judgment for leadership, like location in real estate or the economy in politics. It's the bedrock for everything else. It's also hard to define it, and it's not enough simply to say you know it when you see it. It's a little easier to give some examples of places in which it matters. Second skill, knowing how to get and use information, including crucial data as well as bad news that some folks would prefer you not to know. One of the worst mistakes a leader can make is creating a climate where people are afraid to tell you the truth. Another is relying so heavily on a few advisors that things you really need to know never come to your attention. Third quality, peripheral vision, the habit of looking around to gauge the tone of your environment, to note where the next opportunity or threat is coming from. It's also important to know how to concentrate, but that's useful in lots of settings. Peripheral vision is especially helpful for leaders. Next, courage. Courage is important to successful leadership. Harvard's own Professor Judy Schlar used to say that, quote, "Courage is the only virtue that is universally admired." There are reasons for this, and a lot of them have to do with the specific demands of leadership. Being able to make tough decisions and stick with them, even when the heat is on, being willing to stand up for something you believe in, and having the inner strength of conviction that allows you to face the loneliness that sometimes comes with power. And finally, in the long run, among the most important qualities is integrity, so that people can count on you to do what you say and play fair with them. If you lack this trait, they will be disinclined to follow you and always suspicious of your real motivations. It also helps to have a great deal of stamina, a good sense of humor, and a high tolerance for having everything you do be the subject of someone's speculation and therefore being routinely misunderstood. It helps to be focused on the future. You need to admit your mistakes, and you need to learn from them, but not dwell on them. You use what you've learned and move on. Leaders don't have time to brood incessantly about how they might have acted differently at some moment in the past. If you're a good decision maker, you don't perpetually second-guess yourself. Perhaps most important, successful leaders find an appropriate balance among qualities that don't routinely appear together in human experience. What do I mean? First of all, you need both patience and swiftness, and you need to know when each is called for. That means having a good sense of timing in choosing your issues and developing strategies. But it also means in making decisions, you make not only those that most of the people most of the time think are correct, but neither rushing to closure nor taking forever. And not finding this balance is a major pitfall for a lot of leaders. Next, you need to combine flexibility and firmness, or balance them, so you know when to stand and when to move. You can't always be shifting your ground or be perceived to do so, as John Kerry learned. But if you never shift your ground in response to changing circumstances, you will also come to grief. An equally distinctive and even rarer combination of compassion and ruthlessness is crucial to good leadership. This may surprise you a little bit more, so I'll explain it more fully. To succeed as a leader, you must care about the people you are trying to mobilize, direct, and serve. You need a real sense of empathy for them and for their needs and visions in life. But you also have to be willing to make choices that will have negative consequences for some of them. As a leader, you decide among potential outcomes that are in tension or in conflict. Choosing one course of action privileges some people and disadvantages others, inevitably. That's what it means to decide, to cut a knotty problem. This can seem ruthless to those who come out on the losing side. But you also need empathy for your lieutenants, your colleagues. It doesn't work just to project on them your own needs and visions or ascribe to them the needs and visions it would be convenient for you for them to have. But you have to be willing to give them direct negative feedback, set high standards for their work, and let them go if they don't measure up. That surely feels like ruthlessness to those on the receiving end, and in truth, from their perspective, it is. Next, rhetorical gifts, along with the gifts of a good listener. which are two other qualities often not found in the same person. To succeed as a leader, you need to be able to articulate persuasively what you envision, give voice to inchoate realities, and convince others to see the world that way. But you will surely fail if you fall in love with the sound of your own voice. You need also really to listen to other people. Try to understand their hopes and gripes and dreams as you determine what should best be done and how to do it. It helps also to understand various forms of communication so that you give voice to these realities in somewhat different ways for people of different backgrounds. For instance, faculty members, alumni, students, townspeople, journalists. Good rhetoric helps you reach many different audiences, but that doesn't mean telling lies to some and the truth to others. You should learn instead to use information strategically. You must be absolutely scrupulous about not lying to people. They have to be able to count on your word. But you need to keep in mind the consequences of when and how you share information for achieving whatever it is you're trying to do. Now, several of you here today who are thinking about being leaders or who teach leadership may wonder at this point, okay, which of these traits do I think can be taught or learned? How many can be gained from experience? And which ones are innate, more like having perfect pitch than something you can pick up over time? My sense is that very few of them can be taught in the abstract, but that we can prepare prospective leaders to recognize and work on the traits that will be valuable. A few are no doubt innate, which helps explain why some people are better at being leaders than others or find it easier to lead. But most of them, if not all, can be learned or enriched through experience. Now, in this context, Max Weber notes that anyone who holds power needs three preeminent qualities. They are passion, a feeling of responsibility, and a sense of proportion. Passion in this context means having larger goals in mind, not just advancing your own personal self-interest. But the sense of proportion, what he later calls perspective, is equally important. He describes this, and I quote, as the decisive psychological quality of the politician. Sorry about all these male verbs, but his ability to let realities work on him with inner concentration and calmness, hence his distance to things and men, says Weber. And I think he's right on target here. Leaders do indeed need to care passionately about something, not just to be passionate about holding power. Unless we're committed to some purpose larger than ourselves, our work is doomed by what Weber calls, quote, the curse of the creature's worthlessness. But you also need some degree of detachment from situations, from alternatives, and even from other people, including those most closely involved in your work as lieutenants and support staff. That's part of what I meant by ruthlessness. As Weber goes on to say, these two types of qualities are not usually combined, and I quote again, for the problem is simply, how can warm passion and a cool sense of proportion be forged together in one and the same soul? Now, the need for detachment from other people is one of the main reasons that followers sometimes complain that leaders do not care enough about their personal circumstances, are not sufficiently touchy-feely for their tastes. The difficulty of forging warm passion and a cool sense of proportion, I think, is also one of the reasons that good leaders are not as common as we would like. So finally, what does the impact of the exercise of leadership have on the leader? What does it do to you over time to have significant amounts of power? Power tends to corrupt, says Acton. Is this true? I don't think that power necessarily corrupts the power holder if you have clear values and an effective moral compass when you take power. But exercising power over other people undoubtedly has its effects. As Weber puts it in discussing, quote, the inner enjoyments of a career in politics. And I quote again, first of all, the career of politics grants a feeling of power. The knowledge of influencing people, participating in power over them, and above all, the feeling of holding in one's hands the nerve fiber of historically important events can elevate the professional politician above everyday routine. Now, as we know, some people seek positions of leadership precisely because they already know or suspect that they will enjoy this feeling of power, this sense of holding a nerve fiber in your hands. And even if you accept leadership not because you covet power, but because you want to accomplish something that you're passionate about, having power does indeed differ from not having it. And it is easy to see why people can become addicted to it. It's exhilarating to discover that you can actually make things happen. You can direct the solution of knotty problems. You can help create or sustain a worthwhile institution. You can create conditions that allow other people to do good work. There are undoubted attractions in being able to determine a course of action and then have large numbers of people head in that direction just because you say so. The trappings of power are seductive too. The deference you get on a routine basis, not from everybody to be sure, but enough so you can easily assume that deference is your due. The powerful symbolic impact in a university, for example, of the chain of office, lofty titles, ceremonies in which you represent a highly respected institution, and some of that standing and respect is transferred to you. Having many people ready to do your bidding, there's no doubt this is heavy stuff, heady stuff. But having power also has significant drawbacks as a way to live your life. The job is omnivorous. You could always be doing something that would advance the interests of the organization you're trying to serve. Carving out time for solitude, for refreshment, for recreation is very difficult, even though it's essential for your sanity. You have to avoid developing overly close personal relationships with the people who work with you and for you. You can rightly be accused of favoritism, and you're also in danger of losing your objectivity in leading them. And yet, if you've chosen wisely, many of these people would, in other contexts, be your friends. You cannot often risk being intellectually playful, making too many sardonic comments that come back to haunt you, or floating trial balloons in trying out ideas, because somebody, somewhere down the line, will hear about the trial balloon, take the idea as your decision, and start implementing it. You're always on duty, always on show, because what you do is always interpreted as the actions of the leader, even as representing the organization. But the major pitfall in holding power, to my mind, is lucidly identified by Weber as vanity. Holding power presents you with multiple temptations to vanity, arrogance, pomposity. All those people are flattering you, deferring to you, doing what you say. But Weber says if you fall prey to vanity, you will lose your sense of objectivity and your distance, so that holding power becomes purely personal self-intoxication. Finding a way to sustain what he calls the crucial distance toward oneself is one of the most difficult challenges leaders face. Now, one way to deal with this is to realize that a good part of leadership is playing a role and retain some degree of conscious separation between your public and private personas. But you also have to recognize that you are the leader. You're not just an actor playing the part. You have to believe that whatever your personal faults and deficiencies, you're just as capable of doing the job as anyone else, and more so than most. But you should never make the mistake of thinking that you are therefore superior to other people on every dimension that you can think of, or treat them as instruments unworthy of your respect. Walking that fine line between the essential self-confidence that makes it possible to be comfortable with power and the arrogance or pomposity that occludes your vision and undermines your leadership is another of the difficult challenges that leaders face. Now, whether you agree with these generalizations, find them surprising or predictable, you may wonder at the end what this has to do with being a political theorist. How does what I have just said differ from what any thoughtful, self-critical person might say, looking back at a period of leadership? The way I describe leadership surely reflects my training. I inevitably call on Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Weber to help make my arguments. But it made any difference to me while I was a leader. More than you might imagine. Passages from these and many other political philosophers did turn out to be very helpful to the activity of leadership. I recall their insights in complex situations. Now, you may take that as a shameless plug for assigning the classics of political theory and teaching about leadership, and it is. But it also demonstrates that the training that you have and the way your mind works helps shape the way you exercise power. One other social theorist who proved especially helpful to me across the years was Virginia Woolf. You probably think of her as a novelist, not a social theorist. But some of her works, especially A Room of One's Own, and the less well-known but very powerful Three Guineas, include some deeply thoughtful social philosophy. To explain how and why she influenced me would require another speech on feminist approaches to leadership, which I hope to work on soon. Tonight, I will simply close with a passage from Three Guineas. Woolf was reflecting at the close of the 1930s on the complicated situation in the world. She was especially concerned about the particular contributions that women, who then had opportunities for the first time in history to be leaders in the professions, might make to solving the problems that beset Europe. And she counseled the women who were invited to leadership to think carefully about what they were doing. She asked that we not just play by the same rules that men have always followed, not go along unthinkingly with what we were told was required in exercising power. She wanted women to use our fresh perspective, derived from centuries of being outsiders to all this, to think anew about where we're going, to step back and ponder the direction society is taking, and decide whether we want to use power on these terms or use it to shape our course in somewhat different directions. As she put it, let us never cease from thinking, what is this civilization in which we find ourselves? What are these ceremonies, and why should we take part in them? What are these professions, and why should we make money out of them? Where, in short, is it leading us? The procession of the sons of educated men, which was her phrase for the people who've dominated positions of leadership for so long. Of course, you can't be a successful leader if you only ask such questions. You also must get on with the work, and you often have to play by the same rules that have structured power holding for centuries. But whether you're female or male, you will be a better leader if you do pause occasionally to ask such questions. Step back from what you're doing and try to see it as part of a larger whole. This is one of the most important lessons I learned as a leader from my vocation as a theorist, and I commend it to you tonight. Thank you.
I would say that talk was as advertised, terrific and wide-ranging, both scholarly and practical. So we have microphones positioned at 4 places here, 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 and here. And I'd like to encourage you to come to the microphones and ask a question. I would like to remind you that questions have several important characteristics. Those of you who have been here many times are sick of hearing them, but first characteristic is they are short. And the second characteristic is they end with a question mark. The third characteristic might be that they are on point. So let me start, and we'll just go around the form here. Here we go. A long piece of paper is a worrisome development in a short question with a question mark. Good.
Hi, I'm Michael Gould-Rotowski. I'm a sophomore at the college. Welcome to our school. I had a question of whether you'd be prepared to offer leadership on the possibility, perhaps, of transforming this university from what currently resembles an oligarchy, an 8-member corporation, to a flotilla, as you say, perhaps even a genuine laboratory of democracy. And what steps would you be willing to take to provide the Harvard Corporation with some much-needed transparency and the opportunities for participation to which you attribute such importance, demonstrating the power of leadership rather than mere leadership of power?
Well, as you will understand, since I'm not yet a member of the corporation and I'm just beginning to learn what it does and how it operates and where it goes, I don't feel that I'm in a position tonight to answer your question from the perspective of a member of the corporation. I do think that it is important that senses of accountability and responsibility hold across a university, and I wouldn't have accepted this post in prospect unless I believed that there's a lot of strong leadership at this university. I also know there are a lot of problems that need to be addressed. And one of the things that I really hope to do when I do join the corporation is to bring some of the wisdom that I've tried to gain from being a leader to help the leaders that I will be working with in that capacity.
Thank you.
Up here.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hurdy. I'm an anthropologist. I was struck by your second criterion of leadership, knowing how to obtain useful information. And I'm certainly aware that you're not a member of the corporation yet, but it was, I think, a week ago, one of the members of the corporation told the New York Times that he wasn't aware of any discontent in the faculty at Harvard. And I was wondering, how does one go about, are there any tricks of the trade getting useful information when you're in a governing position?
I should say, by the way, I've always admired your work, and I'm glad that you rose to ask the question, even if it's not about anthropology and women. I think I can answer best from my perspective of having worked with boards of trustees at both Duke and Wellesley, and I realize they're a little different from the corporation, which is a different kind of institution. But one of the things we always had to face was, all right, the trustees are responsible as a whole in the long run for the organization. And each trustee may have opinions, may have ways of getting the opinions, but you can't have trustees going off and talking totally as individuals, pretending to speak for the board. You've got to have some sense that you discuss things and come together with a conclusion that stands for the work of the Board of Trustees. As president, I always found it interesting that some people wanted very much to have, quote, direct access to the trustees. And I thought it was important for the trustees to get to know members of the faculty, students, whatever, and we did encourage that and provided occasions for it. And I assume the same is true at Harvard. But it was also important, particularly when they talked to members of my administration, that they let me know. Not that I didn't want them to talk to the deans or the vice presidents, but if they had concerns, I wanted to know so that we could then talk about it afterwards from both perspectives. And we could avoid in-runs. But with that one exception, we encouraged faculty members to get to know trustees and vice versa, and I think that's healthy.
Up here.
Hi, my name is Michelle Linehan. I'm a Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. And you spoke about leadership in fairly general terms, but I'm curious, do you think women need to approach leadership and leadership roles differently than men, and why or why not?
Well, as I said, I think this is a crucial topic, and I had thought about including a few paragraphs on women in leadership in the talk tonight, and then I thought that's going to take me so far from my major topic, and I couldn't say much in a few paragraphs. I think as I begin to launch the next part of the work and get into that, I will want to argue that, yes, some women do exercise power differently from many men, and that may have something to do with what Virginia Woolf called our many years of experience as outsiders. There is a way in which our socialization as prospective mothers or whatever may give some women particularly a kind of sensitivity. But I hate the notion of generalizing about all women. We talked about this a little bit among the faculty discussion group at lunch. And you know, the first instances that spring to mind to me are Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir. These are not people you would speak of as especially empathetic or feminine in some sense of stereotypical feminine. So I think the answer to your question is very complex. When I was president of Wellesley, I talked about this a lot without having had the chance to really think about it in the great depth that I hope I will now have. And I do think there are some ways to think about difference, but I would be very surprised if they turn out to be uniform.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Elisa Aguilera, and I'm a freshman at the college. So as a member of the class of 2008, I was part of the first time that more female students were admitted into Harvard than male students. However, the Harvard Corporation, which is supposed to represent the students and the faculty, has only had 3 female members in its history. Now, at a school which has a ridiculous low amount of female tenured faculty members, no women's center, and a president who claims innate differences in ability, how do you wish to address these issues, not just as a feminist, but also as a woman?
Well, one of the things I said when I was asked that question when I agreed to run for the corporation was that I don't think it's written in stone anywhere there can be only one woman on the corporation. But I also think these are important objectives that you need to know the institution to develop strategies for. One of the things that we did at Wellesley was to make sure that we had enough men on the Board of Trustees, believe it or not. And at Duke, we worked very hard to make sure that we would increase the number of women, because Duke has been coeducational, you know, of course, if you count Radcliffe, not longer than Harvard, but in terms of formal coeducation, longer than most places. And the number of trustees who were women in 1990, 1973, whatever, was pitiful. And so we made a concerted effort to change that with a lot of specific strategies and pushing and nagging people, and we did. So I know that changes can happen. And I understand the importance of having different perspectives on the corporation. And so women bring, to go back to my answer to the earlier question, I don't think it's enough just to say we want more women because you expect they'll bring different perspectives. I think your point is this is an institution which educates both men and women, employs both men and women, and in the long run, you need to think about the ways in which that's reflected in different parts of the institution.
Up here.
Good evening, President Cohan. My name is Matthew Reisman. I'm a current student at the Kennedy School and an alumnus of Duke, class of 2000. First, just wanted to thank you for your leadership of that institution. I know I shared the sentiments of many alums who feel you did an incredible job of leadership there. A question I had for you tonight was about dealing with resistance to change. During your time at Duke, you helped bring about many changes that I think most of us alums in hindsight feel did wonderful things for the university, but at the time many opposed. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about dealing with such resistance.
That's a very good question. I was thinking about that. I think particularly of one decision, which is part of probably what you have in mind, which was the decision to turn Duke's East Campus, which had been the women's college campus in the old days before Duke became fully co-ed, into a freshman campus. And the way I did it and the way it worked out in the end, I think are rather instructive. So I'm going to take just a minute to answer your question since I avoided anecdotes in my speech. When I took the job at Duke, this question was on the table. What are we going to do with our East Campus? Now that we're coeducation, we have this wonderful campus that used to be a great home to all the women. Now it has people of both sexes, but there's no sense of purpose. You know, people don't want to live over there. Everybody wants to be on the Gothic West. What are we going to do with it? And one of the suggestions, but only one, was let's be really bold and make it a first-year campus. It's just the right size in terms of the number of dormitories, and we can do, we can have a sort of like a small college there for 1,400 freshmen. But there were a lot of people also who thought that was a very bad idea. And so instead of trying to make that decision my first week at Duke, I listened very carefully to a lot of people. And I tried also to build a reputation as someone who would listen, but as someone who would make decisions in the end. So I had that year under my belt, which I think was crucial. Second year, fairly early on, I was willing to propose to the board that we should indeed make East Campus a freshman campus. There was a huge firestorm. I remember we had a celebration of a fun run, and people were standing over the bridges along the campus drive, holding up huge signs saying, keep East Campus as it is, And they were standing out in the main quad telling prospective freshmen not to come. She's ruined the place, you're going to hate it, you'll hate living on East. In fact, in the end, and all my decisions didn't work out this well, but in the end, freshmen have loved being on East. And it turned out to be a very good decision, and most people have forgotten all about the controversy. But it was really tough at the time. I mean, I didn't like to have prospective students being told to go away and not come to Duke because I was ruining the place. But that's part of what I mean by courage. Once I decided it was the right decision and the board was behind me, I wasn't going to turn around just because somebody was holding up signs. But I had to have the time to feel that I had been making it correctly.
Thank you.
Up here.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Akira Tsuchiya. I'm a Master's Public Policy School here at Kennedy School. My question is, what is the difference will be made between the different academic discipline of the university presidency?
Well, I often think about that because, of course, I get to know colleagues who have very different disciplines, and we joke sometimes about how you approach the presidency differently if you're a historian, if you're a classicist, if you're a physicist, you're an economist, a lawyer, a doctor, a political philosopher. I think the main thing is the discipline of being familiar enough with any one of the major forms of learning that you really do have a sense of what faculty members do and why. I think it's difficult often for people who haven't been members of the faculty to become president of a university because they just don't speak the same language. They don't really understand what makes faculty members tick. Some people are successful at it, but it's a lot easier if you know from the inside because you've been there and done that. But in terms of which discipline, I think any of them can be useful. And I've seen people do great things with any of them. I happen to think political philosophy is especially helpful because the kinds of things I studied for most of my life turned out to be relevant to the kinds of things I was dealing with every day. How do you bring a bunch of selfish interests into some common good? Rousseau. I mean, and so I think it's very useful.
Thank you very much.
And here?
But I was pretending to have the general will. I didn't mean that.
I was hoping I could get your comment on national leadership for a moment. I'm sure you have fairly involved opinions about our current president or just the presidential office, but I was wondering if you could offer your observations, perhaps a less one that's less, a more surprising observation perhaps, or one that you don't think people really comment about very much in the press or wherever, in terms of George Bush's strengths and weaknesses, maybe one of each that you think are perhaps not really looked at, but perhaps deserve greater attention?
It's a very interesting question, and I will try to deal with it thoughtfully, but with the caveat that I don't know George Bush personally, and I'm always dubious about responding to things purely on the basis of what I've read in the press or in the books or heard from people. I therefore have some hesitation, but I think it's a fair question. It seems to me that in terms of the categories that I used, you can admire Bush for his decisiveness. He doesn't seem to rush to decisions, but he makes them and he sticks to them. You can admire him for his courage. You can admire him for his ability to not learn from his, not maybe learn from his mistakes and move on. I don't think maybe he spends quite enough time thinking about his mistakes or admitting them, but he's certainly quite willing to say, that's the past, here's the future, we need to move on. In terms of problems, I do think it is a problem that he seems to have such difficulty saying that whatever it was, anything, just wasn't the right decision, and we need to look at that, and we need to replay it, and we need to think about it. I think that's important for a leader to be able to do. It's hard to do, particularly in a job like President of the United States, when you're so much in the public eye. I don't know enough about the way his mind actually works to know how I would assess him on some of the other qualities, like good judgment or whatever, and I don't want to speculate on little knowledge. But I hope that the scenario that I provided might help people to think about how they assess leaders in terms of where they come up short and where they come up long.
Thank you. My name is David Vermeijs. I'm here visiting the Kennedy School of Government in the hope of studying here next year. And coming from the Netherlands, what we hear often, especially in politics on a national level, is more a lack of leadership. So my question is, what can one do to provoke leadership?
I feel I ought to turn to my husband, the other Professor Cohen, who's studying anti-Americanisms this year, and ask him to answer your question. But in terms of provoking leadership, I think provoke is an interesting verb for you to use. I would have thought encourage, sustain, support. Provoke is interesting, though, because what you're saying is you want to get people jolted up, start thinking about being leaders, or do you want to provoke people who are in positions of leadership to exercise leadership? I'm not sure which you meant. You want to encourage people to become leaders, or do you want to do something to the people who are already there and call it provocation?
I think since we have a good number of, let's say, older, very good leaders, I think, but so it's a generation afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, there I think you're raising an important question about how we encourage people to think about leadership and encourage the right people to do it. And it seems to me people like faculty members and students at the Kennedy School or a small handful of other places like this are in a very special position to do that. Because many of you who come here as students have some sense that you might be a leader, that you want to be a leader, or at least you must have considered it at some point. And that's a wonderful ripeness from which I think not only faculty members but other students can help people think through. I don't think that everybody who's ever thought about having an ambition to be a leader should wind up being a leader. But being in a place like this provides you with filters and counsel and advice, and also I would think some provocation to take seriously what it means to be a leader. One other thing we talked about at lunch was, some people who are prospective leaders need a little bit more humility in thinking about what their leadership will be like. But the opposite is also true. Some people who might be great leaders never think of themselves as leaders, and that's where I think provocation can come in. Hello, have you thought about the fact that you might actually do a great job at this? No, not me. So knowing for your friends, for your classmates, for your students, how to help people individually think about leadership and where their qualifications fit with it and where they may still need to learn some things, I think is a great opportunity for a place like the Kennedy School. And maybe taking that seriously will allow us to inspire a generation of new leaders, which we certainly need.
Hi, my name is Evan Schwartz. I'm a senior at the college. I don't know exactly if I'm going to get away with this, but I sort of wanted to hear what your thoughts are on the media storm surrounding President Summers' recent remarks. And I don't know if you think that he's legitimately attempted to provoke academic discourse, if you think he's truly countered his overall goals and done something that he really should have stayed away from, and where can he go from here to try to fix things?
Well,
That's a yes or no answer.
that's a yes or no answer. In terms of the media storm, I'm sure I'm aware of only part of what's going on, but certainly a lot of people have been talking about it since I've been back up at Harvard today. It seems to me one thing that we ought to keep in mind, and I'm afraid is in some danger of getting lost, is for better or for worse, even if you don't agree with the way he did it or the reasoning that he expressed, Larry Summers has put the issue of recruiting and supporting women faculty and women in science right on the agenda. I was thinking about my own experience as a leader. One of the things that I was faulted for, particularly by my PR people, was I did the faculty thing of on the one hand, on the other hand, here, there. So I would give great eloquent speeches. There'd be no sound bites. Sound bites can come back to haunt you, clearly. But for better or for worse, the issue is on the table. I can't tell you how important that is, and I don't want us to lose that opportunity. There was a huge forum at Stanford on this issue, which I was afraid was going to be just, quote, Summers bashing. It wasn't at all. It turned out to be 3, 4 really strong scholars at Stanford in fields that are relevant here: cognitive science, educating engineers, talking about what they know from their disciplines. And I'm sure this may be happening on other campuses. This is a unique opportunity for us to say, we don't have enough women faculty members. We don't have enough women in science. What are we going to do about it? And President Summers has appointed some really good task forces. He didn't just appoint sort of namby-pamby people, some really strong people, and apparently given them resources and his support. I mean, I hope that one of the things that doesn't get lost in all this is, hey, this is a great opportunity to make both Harvard and everybody else who's listening a better place.
This is going to sound like I'm trying to provoke you on a specific issue, and I'm not. I'm just using a specific example to make a generalization. Recently at the college, I'm sorry, my name is Abe. I'm a freshman at the college. There's been an initiative towards wind energy being a part of the term bill and helping out energy here. And one of the things that's gotten in the way is sort of this ideological question about whether Harvard, as a premier university in the world and in the nation, has a responsibility to stay out of potentially politically dicey issues such as wind energy or, green energy like that. How do you see Harvard as a leader in the world, the academic world, at home and abroad? How do you see that leadership playing into being either progressive or just maintaining the status quo? Where do you draw the line between being courageous and making a change and being too provocative and making a change?
Could you tell me this is a new topic to me. What exactly is Harvard being asked to do?
Oh, okay. A group on campus, I can't remember the name, it's like Harvard Students for Wind Energy, something like that.
Right. They want Harvard to be involved in investing, using, whatever?
Yes, using wind energy on campus. There are a number of other schools that have done similar projects. I believe one of the schools here has actually done it on the Harvard campus, but not the college. And the idea is that there would be an opt-out option on the term bill to pay $10. You decide whether you do or don't, and that $10, if you decide to do it, would go towards funding the wind energy.
Thank you. That's helpful. There, it seems to me that the fact that it is such a complicated, decentralized university is relevant. I mean, I don't think any single person can say Harvard is now going to make wind energy happen and have other people feel that was his right, that's exactly what we ought to be doing. But you can certainly put the topic on the table and talk about it in particular schools and begin to think about what it would feel like to have a strategy. I never thought about that as a particular issue, but I certainly know, as does everybody in this room, that universities have periodically in the past had to face major social issues. And always one of the big questions is, I'm not sure quite how it plays into wind energy, but I can see that it might, is should the university take a stand? And some of the biggest discussions are always, we're objective, not everybody believes in wind energy, so Harvard shouldn't do anything about it. I'm a veteran of the divestment years, and I know how deeply felt the arguments about divestment from South Africa were, and trying to trying to deal with that, making sure people felt they were heard, making sure I gave the wisest counsel I could to the Board of Trustees, and then dealing with the aftermath when they decided in a way that the students didn't like. I mean, I think leaders at a place like Harvard or Duke or Wellesley are in the end responsible when issues like that are on the table for making sure there's an appropriate process, way of thinking about it. Not of immediately coming out tomorrow and saying I'm for or against wind energy. But I was thinking, we just drove to Yosemite from Palo Alto, and on 580, there's huge number of windmills. So if you're really interested in wind energy, I have a road for you.
This is going to have to be the last question.
Hi, I'm Allison Raymer. I was interested, although you kind of listed a good list of things that would be for a good leader, what you would do if you saw a bad leader coming to power and how you could possibly take that leader push them into a different position or take them.
Are you studying with Professor Kellerman? Is this? Well, Barbara Kellerman, who's right behind you, has written an excellent book on bad leadership. And one thing, in an earlier version of the talk, which was longer than I had allowed to me, I talked a little bit about Weber's point about responsibility, and said that the sense of responsibility, being willing to take responsibility for what you do instead of sort of, backing away from it, is one of the things that distinguishes good leadership from bad leadership. I think there are quite a few, and I commend Professor Kellerman's book to you. I think it's part of the problem, though, in the answer that I just gave you, is I think it's a little unfair to assume that people will fall into one category or another. We all have times when we think, I wish I'd made that decision differently. As I said, I think you need to be able to move on. But sometimes somebody might call somebody a bad leader at a particular stage in their leadership term because they don't like a decision or a set of decisions. And then in the long run might have a different assessment. So it's a term you have to be careful about using. But I certainly think there are some people who just turn out to be bad leaders, whether it's ineffective or corrupt or tone deaf or rigid. And if they do it over periods of years, then I think you have to see it. But I'd be careful about using the term too loosely.
All right, well, thank you, Nan, for just a terrific evening. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.